Okay.
En die twee receivers raak nie mekaar nie. Straal en raak hulle so snaaks geluid. So die een sit
Okay.
die een kant en die sit die ander kant.
Okay, kan iemand gaan
Sit dit sommer aan jou want ek gaan heeltyd praat. Jy is een stem wat gaan praat hier binne.
ja,
Dus sit sommer albei en elkeen op
bepaal. Nou daar is een spreker wat hierso is. Wat
Okay, nou gaan ons net
ek sal
Maar sy het klaar gepraat.
hy
Was al twee jaar.
ja, is 'n ander een. Ja.
okay, dan gaan ons net hierdie ene vir die interruption, ja? Ja. Hoe stream dit weer? Nee, ook
Nou, okay.
so as jy net vir daai spreker op albei sal gee en ook net sê die receiver moet nie aan mekaar raak nie.
Ja, wat kan ek sê? Is altyd lekker. Is altyd lekker.
Het jy gehoor hoe werk die besigheid, nê? Dat ons kan een ou op 'n slag actually opgaan
Ja.
en dan moet ek 'n e-pos stuur sodra daai ou besig is vir die volgende ou om te connect want hulle kan maksimum twee op 'n slag.
Okay. Ja.
Okay.
Okay, so wat ek gaan doen is ek gaan net almal introduce. Ek gaan net die topic introduce en dan almal introduce en dan so vir deurgaan. Okay.
Ja.
Okay,
Ja.
cool.
Ja.
Begin ons?
Ek ken hom nou, ek nog nie iemand op nie. Maar ons gaan maar begin nou. Verstaan jy? Maar nie nou nie, sorry. Nou as sodra hy op is, dan ons moet begin.
Ja, okay.
Ons draai al 5 minute by die tyd. Dus die mense sit nou en kyk.
Jy nog vir Renée? Okay.
Ek weet nie eens hoe lyk sy, dis vir wat.
Ek het dan nou weer daar onder gesien by die laag.
Sit ek in donker swam. Sê gek so.
Hallo. Testing. Gentlemen, signing in from all over the world. We are just waiting for our first presenter to come online, so we will wait about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll start the webinar. Thank you so much for your patience. and a heartily good afternoon from South Africa. It is a great pleasure that I introduce our second webinar for our conference, which is called Pathways to Flourishing for Individuals, Organizations and Communities. During the next hour, we will take you through a wonderful journey on how to develop flourishing individuals, how to foster thriving organizations, and how to build and cultivate positive communities. It's a great pleasure that I kind of introduce our speakers to you today. First off, we will start off with nwu-pukke, who used to be the president of the Psychological Society in South Africa. She's currently the managing director of her own consulting firm. She will be talking about Ubuntu and how to foster inclusiveness through positive psychological approaches. Secondly, we will then hand over to Professor Franz Cilia, who will talk about a very innovative approach towards understanding flourishing from a systems psychodynamic perspective. We will then be handing over to three of our international colleagues. Firstly, Professor Franz van der Vyver, who will talk about the management of inclusivity as a means to facilitate the building of positive relationships. Then we will hand over to Professor Saskia Kelders, who will then talk about how do you build flourishing individuals, communities, and organizations through the utilization of apps. And finally, we will end off with Professor Ruud Veenhoven, who is the father of the hedonic approaches towards happiness and flourishing at work. He will talk about relational orientation towards flourishing. So with that said, we're going to start off with Ms. nwu-pukke. Thank you very much.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Kindly accept my sincere apologies for not being able to join you at this esteemed conference, but I'm happy to share with you my part of the presentation. I must say I was a little bit harassed when I noticed that I have to be on a panel with all professors, and I'm only still a miss. I'm grateful that the university upgraded me to a Mrs., but I can't be married to my father. Nonetheless, let's get into the presentation. So my piece is about Ubuntu, the spirit at work. I think as South Africans, and particularly as industrial psychologists, we talk about this word Ubuntu quite often without the full understanding of what it means and what it means to our audiences as well. And particularly if we're talking about research, I mean, a lot of work has been done and written about Ubuntu. You go the world over and people are talking about Ubuntu. We just haven't quite looked at the mirror right here at home in terms of what it means and what it would particularly mean in the workplace. So my piece is really about looking into Ubuntu and thinking about which areas we will need to focus on in terms of research to bring this point home and make it very relevant to our audiences right here in South Africa. So I'm going to take you through, just a greeting and a context, and I'll talk to it when I get to it. It's called How Are the Children? The diagnosis that where we're currently sitting at as a country, as well as the legislative framework, how Ubuntu is defined, and just the spirit at work, what it would mean for a normal indigenous South African, and what therefore our response ability is. We have an ability to respond, so that's not a spelling mistake at all. And unfortunately, I will not be here to take questions, but if there are any questions, I'm sure they can be referred via Prof. Rothman, and I'll be happy to answer them. So how are the children? And I'm asking this question 24 years later. As you can see in my slide there, we have the Maasai warriors, and we're told that the Maasai of Kenya, actually, when they greet each other, in all their warriorship, they always ask a basic question which says, how are the children? And the essence of that question is basically around the future. They are asking about the future of their tribe. Are the children well looked after? And I've looked at some of the, the issues we're grappling with 24 years into democracy. We're talking land ownership. We have the biggest inequality. We have economic freedom being bandied around. Youth graduate employment or unemployment is on the high. We actually have an association for unemployed youth. The advent of consumerism, where all our kids want is to consume and consume without any, regard in terms of how they can be part of the production and part of the economy at large. Cultural shame, excessive corruption. We've had so many cases of just blatant racism. At one point, one would think that people are doing it just to get popular because it can't be that blatant. Femicide is on the increase. You know, we're killing our women, and poor service delivery everywhere. We even used to the service delivery protests that we have as a country. We are now in a country where the history as it is what one would call the master's history. You know, the history is not representative of the full story of what happened in South Africa, and we continue to bandy that. Rogue religion. In the past few years, we've seen pastors who make people drink petrol, you know, so that they can be saved, or spray them with doom. The advent of violent crime, and I mean, it happens now even in public. We're not safe anywhere as a country. All of this, you know, have led us to question the quality of education, right through from primary school education, and now through the fees must fall, we're now talking more about decolonizing the curriculum and making it more relevant. And all of that has to be done within a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, as well as the fourth industrial revolution that we talk about so much. And what I've really gone and done is spoken to a lot of people and said, if we were to diagnose the state our country is in, particularly the socio-economic state, we would say it has a collective, continuous, post-traumatic stress disorder. And a young gentleman who I sit with in one of the university advisory boards actually said he thinks we are in a deep depression as a country. So how are the children 24 years later? If we look at where we are at the moment, where it feels like things are not working, one would say that we have a system failure in the matrix. And when the system is down, obviously it affects people mentally as well. And we know anything that is impacted upon mentally gets to be impacted in terms of how we behave and what we feel and what we eventually do, not only to ourselves, but to each other as well. Hence the call for Ubuntu, and probably thinking about what it means in the workplace. All right, so if you ask about Ubuntu, is there a legislative framework around it? Yes, of course there is. I mean, the Constitution of the Republic, you know, the values or the value base of the Constitution is around Ubuntu. The Bill of Responsibilities, I actually found this out recently, that the Department of Basic Education encourages Ubuntu through this Bill of Responsibilities, which means that children should be taught about Ubuntu at an early age. The preamble of the 2011 White Paper on Southern African Foreign Policy in terms of how we relate to the rest of the SADC region is based on Ubuntu. The Batho Pele or People First principles in the civil service were based on Ubuntu. The Truth Reconciliation Commission as well, the Moral Regeneration Movement, and right there in South African Code of Arms, where it says diverse people unite, it talks about Ubuntu. And one would ask, if this is so embedded, you know, why is it not happening? Why are we not seeing Ubuntu in action 24 years down the line? Further to the legislative framework around Ubuntu, if one looks at the indigenous knowledge system, we have a whole lot of legislation, and I'm not going to go through all of them, perhaps except for the indigenous knowledge system policy of 2004, as well as the indigenous knowledge systems or traditional knowledge bill of 2016. We're still debating what it is going to be called, so we don't know what it is going to be called. I'm singling out those two because not only do they you know, acknowledge or not only do all the legislation acknowledge the framework which talks to more traditional cultural belief systems, but these two in particular promote the use of indigenous knowledge system and, you know, everywhere in society, including in the workplace as well. So it is important to understand that there is a legislative framework that supports that. And I know your eyes are probably looking at the Witchcraft legislation and Traditional and Allied Health Professions Act. All of this is part of the diversity that we have in our society. Actually, there is research that shows that 80% of South Africans, be they Christian or not, they still consult traditional healers or alternative healers for that particular instance, which makes it even easier for us to introduce Ubuntu at an indigenous knowledge system level. So let's define Ubuntu. We've broken down the two words. Ubu, part of Ubuntu, means the indispensable part of the lived experience, which manifests through our relationships with other people. So it's about you becoming human, which cannot be about you as an individual, but it's about how your humanity interacts with other people's humanity. And then 2, part of it is often defined as the causative force, the godliness, the beingness, the spirit, the human spirit, whatever it is that keeps us alive and leaves our bodies when we die, would then be then 2 aspects of it. So for me, what's important is just that last line under 2 that says universal resemblance, which says to us that's the one part that all humans have in common, and it brings us together. All of us are the same through the spirit that lives within us. So again, defining Ubuntu not only through the generous or the usual definitions of I am because you are, or you need me for us to be one and we should be one. That's very generic. This is about the universal resemblance in humanity. So Ubuntu, therefore, is both a state of being and one of becoming, and it's a process of self-realization, which does not only happen with you as an individual, but it happens through other people as well. So to know that you are human, you have to identify with other humans, and in that way you can confirm your humanity. We've looked at quite some of the reading around Ubuntu that we have in the country, and one that caught my eye was Mbigi and Maria, where they talk about the key values of Ubuntu, being group solidarity, conformity, compassion, respect, human dignity, and collective unity. A.E. Donker actually contextualized it and said the individual is not a physical being, but a spiritual and divine individual who lives with other human beings. Again, kind of emphasizing that definition of Ubuntu. And Franz Cilia says it's about sacrificing for others selflessly and caring for and protecting fellow human beings. If you look at this, it sounds very general, but it's these humans that walk into the workplace. It's these humans that interact with each other. And as industrial psychologists, we looked at the individual, how that individual interacts in the team, and how the teams collectively work towards achieving the organizational vision. We also say that an effective employee has to have those 3 things in check. They need to have personal mastery, and that, for me, would be the base for Ubuntu. Technical expertise, which is the skills and the knowledge, and also knowledge of the business or the industry in which they operate. So if we zoom into the personal mastery aspect of it, that is where really Ubuntu lies. And we know that if people do not understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and they do not have a path in terms of how they become more effective, not only as human beings, but as employees as well, we know that they cannot be effective. So if you look at the individual in terms of Ubuntu, what do they need to have? They need to have an identity. You know, this could be a cultural identity as well, a level of spirituality, justice, fairness, respect, reciprocity, knowing that whatever they give, they should also receive. Loving kindness, compassion, attentiveness, responsiveness, and sharing. If you look at all of these qualities as well, this is what we need people to bring into the workplace. What I like about Maria and Biggie is that they took it further and they said, let's look at the various levels of spirit in an African traditional, and particularly Southern African traditional knowledge perspective. And they kind of likened it to the various qualities that we would expect at work. And I like comparing the 2. It's called the Dembe-Tembe model, where they say the lowest level is that of where somebody has a witch spirit, and any African would know about this, so these people that are cynics, are negative, they're full of destruction, and they bring that sort of energy in the workplace, they'll be at that level. We've got the avenging spirit, which is driven by bitterness, anger, and revenge. And we're beginning to see a lot of that in the workplace as well, where people believe, they're entitled to certain things, and if they don't get them, they go into anger and revenge, all the violence that has been happening in the workplace. The wandering spirit is the spirit of creativity or having a particular obsession. So if it's a particular obsession, it can be negative in the workplace because this person wants to do just one thing. Whereas the spirit of creativity is welcomed, particularly in light with the 4th Industrial Revolution. The family spirit are the people who look at the survival of self and the survival of team. So you can imagine a supervisor and his small team and them working together and, emphasizing more team unity or team cohesion over anything. The war spirit, also called majukwa, is that of power and conflict. We're seeing a lot of that now where people rise. And I mean, if you look at the political space, for example, in South Africa, where we're now talking factions and, people want power. And because of that fight for power, there's a lot of conflict. That would be likened to the spirit of majukwa. The divination spirit, the spirit of authority and truth, probably what we need more than anything in most of our workplaces, where people take responsibility, take accountability, are honest and truthful, and probably practice what we call authentic leadership. The hunter spirit, the mushavi spirit, probably maybe the highest level of where we would want an employee to be. And by the way, these spirits are kind of cumulative. It's like going up a ladder. That's where the spirit of performance and enterprise lies. So we want more mushavis or more hunter spirits in the workplace. And the question is, how do we cultivate that? And then right at the top is the rainmaker spirit. And I think this is my favorite. Not only does it look at morality and dignity, if you look at the rainmaker concept, when rain falls, it falls on everybody. Rain looks at, how can I bless this part of land or this parched part of land so that something can grow out of it and the land can be productive. So imagine if we had rainmaker type of leaders who don't only look at, we have this thing in the workplace where we say if people are not working properly, we manage them out of the organization. A rainmaker spirit wouldn't do that because rain falls on all people alike, whether they are sinners or criminals or, they are good human beings. It falls on all people alike. And the impact there is to say, let's give dignity because, people do things that they're not supposed to do, in life, but let us build them up. Let us, have the rain fall on them so that we can build them up as individuals. So it looks for that small little good that is left within the individual and builds them up to be the best person that they can be. So if you look at the spirit and you look at the fact that I know the names that he used, they are particularly from Zimbabwe, which is part of Southern Africa, and a lot of them relate to the languages that are used in our country in South Africa. If we went into that type of research and started speaking this type of language in the workplace, for me, that is how we are going to bring the spirit at work. I recently went to a conference in the US where they study African psychology. They've been doing that since 1968, so that's about 50 years of research that they have. And what is interesting about that is that in their 4th year, they actually come to the continent. They even come to South Africa. They'll tell we go deep into Limpopo, we go to Mapungubwe, we go to Venda, and we sit there and we see how people cope from an indigenous knowledge base. And they've written books and upon books of this information about us. And my challenge is always, there we go again, we're going to read about ourselves from somebody else's perspective. And to all the researchers out there, my stance then becomes, let's go out and study our own people. Some of this information that we require is right at our doorsteps. We don't need to be reading about it from somebody else's perspective who is outside of our space. We need to be packaging and shipping this information out. And one of the other things that comes up in terms of this research is the 5 P's of Ubuntu by our very own Professor Franz Cilia. And he says when you have all those 5 principles, again, you are then able to bring the spirit of Ubuntu alive. People-centeredness, we all know what it means. My favorite one there is the permeable walls, allowing for open communication in our workplaces, allowing for celebrated diversity in our workplaces. Partisanship, creating a spirit where people can be loyal, or an environment where people can be loyal, and there's freedom of association. And in this case, not freedom of association, because I have to or because this is where I earn my living, but freedom of association because people want to be there and they see this vision and they need to speak in one voice as South Africans. The progeny, collective decision making, involving staff at all levels when we're deciding about the future, the strategy. When I do my OD work, I go and I say, I want a full representative spectrum of this organization at the strategic planning session because you need insights from everybody at the various levels in the organization to be able to decide on a way forward. This top-down approach, as we know, is not sustainable. Production as well. Imagine a South Africa where we all prosperous in a very conducive environment as well. I mean, all of these are the 5 P's of Ubuntu, and if we have all of these in check, of course, we will have a workplace that is productive, that is effective, that contributes towards the economic growth that we so need as a country. And how do we move forward? And that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is that we move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And a growth mindset embraces challenges, it persists in obstacles, it sees effort as necessary. So it might look like a daunting task to go and look for research out in Limpopo, in Venda, or deep in the rural Eastern Cape. But if we see the need for it and we understand that it is important, that we start to create a body of knowledge that is relevant to the majority of the population or to the majority of our audiences that we are producing research for, then we take pride in our work. We become more relevant because we can see an impact that we make as industrial psychologists. Growth mindset also lends from criticism. Of course, things have not been done properly in the end, but every day is an opportunity for a new beginning. And my point is that that's where we need to move from. You know, let's take what we did wrong, acknowledge it, and move forward. A growth mindset is also inspired by other success. So let's look at people that have done this well, and let's see how they've gone back and really looked at, you know, how things work, you know, at the grassroots level in our various communities, and let's be inspired by them and learn from them in terms of research and in that space. And my call in closure is that my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. And this was from Desmond Tutu. Thank you. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Kindly accept my sincere apologies for not being able to join you at this esteemed conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Franz Cilia, and my topic is, first slide please, towards flourishing individuals, organizations and communities, a system psychodynamic stance. So the systems approach is already in the title, as you will see the micro, meso and macro there, and the psychodynamic part means that I will also talk about unconscious behaviors. Time is limited, so I need to move quite fast. I was lecturing at the Potchefstroom University in the previous century, and it's good to be back on the Noordwes-universiteit campus. So thank you to Professor Rothman for making this possible. I did a PhD in positive psychology. It was not positive psychology called then. I was trained at the Center for the Studies of the Person, which is the Carl Rogers Institute in San Diego in California, and I based that on my doctorate research as well. Then I joined UNISA as a professor in industrial organizational psychology, and I also changed from positive psychology to system psychodynamics. I think I jumped ship a little bit, but positive psychology will always be part of my interest, and I think it represents the roots of my identity in psychology. The next slide. I have coined the primary task of my presentation as follows: to provide opportunities to think about languishing and flourishing as two contrasting behaviors. So it's by intent that I mention both, from a system psychodynamic stance, and to develop an understanding of the relevant manifesting conscious and unconscious behavior acted out systemically, that's individual, group, organization, society, in order to further insights and inputs in our roles as psychologists, consultants, coaches, and researchers. So I think I will argue here that it's often very difficult for individuals, organizations, and communities to flourish because of larger systemic and dynamic processes at play in life. I need to say something about system psychodynamics because I think it's a little bit strange perhaps in the audience or for a positive psychology orientated audience. This is very different from positive psychology as a paradigm, the assumptions about behavior, as well as the conceptualization and the operationalization that we use as psychologists. This is a depth psychology paradigm. It's informed by Freudian social psychoanalysis, object relations, the Tavistock group relations view, transactional analysis, which is coming back into system psychodynamics, and systemic thinking. And it studies the manifesting conscious and unconscious behavior relevant in individual, group, organizational, and societal phenomena. System psychodynamics studies the systemic. What I mean with systemic is studying both sides of the linearity of, for example, languishing as opposed to flourishing. It's also in Gestalt psychology studying the foreground and the background, or the figure and ground as we know. And it's also looking at the micro, meso, and macro elements of organizational behavior, for example. It also studies social behavior, so the other, these could be people or objects, are always in the interpretation or in the field of study. It studies dynamic behavior, so consciously we could refer to mechanics, but unconsciously we could refer to dynamics. It's here and now focused. Then it looks at conscious rational behavior, as well as unconscious irrational behavior. But important, on the conscious level, we talk about relationship, and in the unconscious we refer to the relatedness. So it's a different kind of connection towards a deep understanding of systemic identity, and in this case, what is available in languishing and in flourishing. It could help to think not in this presentation of behavior or of people, but as objects. So I will treat in the rest of the conversation languishing as well as flourishing as objects in the mind. Just before I go into a working hypothesis that I started to construct for the purpose of this event, some concepts that I think need some explanation. I have referred to rational and conscious behavior, I think, which we all know about, and then the unconscious and the irrational. This is not the unconscious as the dark parts of the psyche, as we've learned in our first years in psychology, that needs to be avoided or that will give you nightmares. This is just the unconscious that's available with information that contains all our history or our identity even before we were born. And this is then called the repressed. So if we repress anything, according to the theory, it will appear again in consciousness until we address it. And then the associative unconscious. That means that we use transference from past experiences into new experiences to find familiarity there. Anxiety is not part of clinical psychology. Here it says it's the fear of the future, which we all have and constantly have. Then defensive structures, which I will use in my hypothesis, is splitting, introjection, and projection. The splitting is as basic as what Melanie Klein and Winnicott refer to when the baby is born and the mother holds the baby. It needs to differentiate between what is good versus what is bad. Good is associated with my tummy is full, I'm sleeping, I'm okay, I wake up, I'm hungry, my tummy is empty, and then I feel bad. And that's the primary split of between good and bad that we use throughout life. Introjection will refer to what I take in, own as my own. So the introjected material will say something about that I identify with as part of me. And the introjective identification would then mean I am identifying with what I have taken in from society about who I am and how I operate. Projection is then the out defense. That is what we project onto others or objects outside of ourselves. And projective identification would then be if that object or person identifies with what has been projected onto or into. Just a few examples before I get to the hypothesis, which could help in terms of your understanding perhaps. Some of the experiences and research that I am busy with. First of all, I'm working in the field of diversity. I'm part of a group of psychologists who go to Robben Island every year in November for a week where we do these sessions. We do system psychodynamic group work there, where we study the split between race and gender, for example, and then the projections from one onto the other. So it's hard and intense work from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. Another one is studying bullying. it's not only about the bully, but it's also about the victim and the relationship between and how that acts into what's also called the dance of death. And there we work with these complex paradoxes of imagine an innocent perpetrator and a guilty victim. So consciously it doesn't make sense, but if we study the dynamics of it, that is what happens between these two parts. Another one is silo behavior in organizations, where the study is about inclusion versus exclusion. Another one is corruption and state capture. I believe psychology has been very silent about this matter, which is very prominent in the country, where we study the split between good or ethical behavior and bad behavior, where there's quite a lot of non-ethical behavior, greed, selfishness, narcissism, and entitlement, for example. I'm also very aware and excited about the Optentia unemployment project, and I think unemployment has also some of that split, and what is then associated with this side and that side, and what gets projected from one onto the other. My hypothesis sounds like this. It could help if you don't attend to all the detail, but just listen to the flow of this. As a response on existential, survival, and persecutory anxiety, the system defends itself. The first defense is split. The system splits itself between the objects of bad, here we call it languishing, and the good, here we call it flourishing. The bad represents the denigration, the not good life, and the good represents the idealization, the good life, or feeling and functioning good. The second defense is projection. The subsystem that we call languishing projects the idealization onto the subsystem of flourishing with its associated behaviors of well-being. Languishing has then thus dissociated itself from important parts of the self, the splitting off or the export, and has given this to flourishing to hold or to contain on its behalf. Bion refers to this as an act of trust, to hold on to important parts intact until ready to take them back, as opposed almost like how we deposit money in a bank. The third defense is then introjection. The subsystem in the position of languishing introjects the denigration into the self, owning its associated behaviors of lack of well-being. Languishing thus identifies with the shadow side of the phenomenon. A fourth defense is then projected and introjected identification. Through the continuous enforcement of the projection and introjection, both subsystems identify with its given and taken psychic material to the point that it becomes part of its psychic identity. Thus, the defenses become institutionalized, making the connection with the other, the opposite, very difficult. The opposite manifests, obviously, in the object flourishing towards languishing. Thus, we accept here that the two parts of languishing and flourishing is interconnected, but in this case with a split in between. This makes it very difficult for people if they are locked into this position of either introjecting or projecting to move beyond and to make use of the other side. I've also tried to start working with a hypothesis about unemployment, employment, but seeing that I don't have lots of time left, I will just briefly say that we can also then gather that unemployment could maybe be associated with languishing, which is then also an introjected state. And if you are living in a very poor community and you don't have work, it's very prominent then to live that life, which is also projected from the other side. The same with having work and be employed, and that could be associated with the good life and flourishing, and then the split is very difficult, is contained, and that makes it very difficult from the one to move on to the other. My last slide would be then the now what. What do we do as consultants in this model to help people move from the one side to the other, especially if they are locked in their society and in their living conditions? Consulting in this scenario involves complex system psychodynamic group work focusing on the task to become aware of and to process the unconscious defensive structures that lead to both psychological positions of being stuck in the split. by denying parts of the self and acting as a container of parts of the other. So what we need is insight and the owning of aspects of the real self with its negative and positive parts lead to the integration of identity. Very complex work, but still possible to do. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Cilia. Are there any questions from the audience? No? I think then we'll wait till the end to ask all the questions to all the speakers. Thank you very much, Professor Cilia, for a lovely presentation. We are going to go directly now into Professor Saskia Kelder's presentation, and Professor Kelders will talk to us about how do you construct interventions, flourishing interventions around the utilization of online technologies. Professor Saskia Kelders is at the University of Twente. She's an assistant professor there in psychology, and she's also an extraordinary professor with our department, Optentia. So with that, Professor Kelders, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lou, for this introduction. I don't know if I'm already up on the screen. Or is everything working?
Professor Kelders, we are not able to hear you. Would it be possible to just up your volume of your mic?
I'll try. Yeah. Anything hearing now? No sound?
Not really. A little bit louder. It's we can hear you, but it's really, really soft.
I'll try and use, see if I can use different microphone. Just
Professor Kelders, our technical team indicated that you could kindly just remove your headphones from the jack and just put up the volume, and then we'll continue from that perspective. So please just kindly pull out your earphones from the mic jack, and then we'll try again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just currently experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties. We will be back in about 5 minutes. Sorry about the inconvenience. Testing. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. Kan julle net vir 'n oomblik daai kant toe wys dat net die slides opsit? Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. While we're trying to get Professor Kelders on the line, I will then continue with my presentation. So basically, I'd quickly like to talk to you guys about this new paradigm about flourishing at work. We've had a little bit of an indication today about what is flourishing and how we can kind of like approach this from a system psychodynamic perspective. We had nwu-pukke talk about what the impact of building flourishing societies have, and I want to give you a little bit of indication about some of the work that we've been doing regarding flourishing at work. So I'll quickly talk about three things, just to give you a brief indication about what flourishing is, what flourishing at work then entails, and then how we can go about developing flourishing within our organizational context. So let's first start with flourishing. Flourishing basically refers to a top-end, basically refers to the top-end level of human happiness. It basically is a combination of hedonic perspectives, which means we're looking for pleasure and avoiding pain, and eudaimonic approaches, we're saying we're living in accordance with our own strengths and our own daemons. So Corey Keyes basically then went about constructing a new theory on human happiness, indicating that in order for us to flourish in life, we have to feel good, we have to function well, and we have to fit in. In other words, we have to have emotional well-being, psychological well-being, and social well-being. So, like I've indicated, the first component that Corey Keyes mentioned in his theory was that in order for a person to flourish in life, they need to feel good. In other words, they have to have emotional well-being. And emotional well-being is basically the construction of like having high levels of life satisfaction and having a balance between the positive and negative emotions that we experience in life. Secondly, he indicated that in order for us to then to flourish, we need to be able to function well at work. So we have to have high levels of psychological well-being. He indicated that in order for us to be psychologically well, we have to feel acceptance, we have to have a strive towards personal growth and development, we have to have meaning in our lives, we have to see the things that we're doing is contributing to larger society. We should be able to feel like we're mastering our environment, and we should be able to build positive relationships with people. We should also be able to have to do what we want, when we want, and how we want. In other words, we have to feel like we are autonomous at work or in life. Finally, we should be able to fit into our social environment. And he basically indicated that social well-being is the construction of feeling socially integrated. In other words, feeling that you're fitting in, accepted by your community or your society, feel like we're making a social contribution to the lives of others, and feeling like there's some other connection between ourselves and our contexts. So, as we know, why is flourishing important? We know that if you flourish, you're half as likely to be disabled, you live longer, you have healthy habits, you've got better relationships, lower blood pressure, especially in this heat, and you're able to tolerate more pain. So, taking this foundation theory, Professor Ian Rothman then went about and translated this into a model about flourishing at work. So what he basically argued was that flourishing refers to a state of positive work-related well-being or mental health, which is then categorized again by feeling good, functioning well, and fitting in at work. If that's the only thing that you guys remember after our presentation, I will love you for it. Okay, so in order for us to feel good, function well, and fit in, we have to kind of like figure out what are some of the attributing factors attached to it and what are some of the consequences. So, so as with Corey Keyes' original model, there are the three main components, right? But the antecedents relating to work-related context is a little bit different. So where we have in work-related context, we have job satisfaction and effect balance, where in the original context we have life satisfaction, right? From a psychological well-being perspective, he integrated self-determination theory, where he basically argued that in order for us to be psychologically well at work, we have to have high levels of autonomy, feeling that we have high levels of competence and relatedness. We should be able to see that our work, the fourth component, connects to something larger, and we have to feel that we're making an active contribution. We have to feel like we're in a moment of flow, so engagement, and there should be a focus on lifelong continuous learning. And there should also be aspects relating to harmony. In other words, we have to build social well-being at work through creating opportunities for ourselves to connect better with our colleagues, to utilize the strengths of our team in order to really understand how we can kind of like build flourishing or flowing teams. So what are some of the determinants or antecedents of flourishing at work? So research has shown there are various contextual factors which like attributes to flourishing at work, the opportunity to control my work, the ability to be able to use certain skills, to have interpersonal contacts with people, to set very high goals for ourselves and being very demanding tasks, in order to have job variety, so doing the same thing over and over and over does not attribute to flourishing, but being able to have doing different things in different time stamps kind of like helps us in that perspective. To have physical and job security at work, which I think is really relevant to our specific context, and to have a valued position provides us with an opportunity to flourish at work. There are various job characteristics which has also been associated. So we know from the job demands and job resources model that high demands kind of like decreases flourishing, and job resources kind of like increases flourishing at work. We kind of like know that if there is a connection between the work that we do and the expectations that we have, that we will be able to flourish. In other words, if I know exactly what my manager expects of me, then I can kind of like attribute or channel my energy in that specific direction in order to help us to flourish at work. If there's a big fit between the person that I am and the work that I do, in other words, if I can live out my strengths at work, I'm more inclined to flourish. And we know that if I experience high levels of leader empowering behaviors, that it will help us to flourish. Social factors on the other end, if I've got good relationships with my supervisor, by the way, research has shown that you should have about 11 positives to 1 negative experience with your manager in order to flourish, which is exactly the same as you need with your wife. So your manager with your boss is just as important as your manager with your wife or your spouse, which is really interesting. We should have very good relationships with our peers. In other words, we should feel that there's high levels of psychological safety and psychological availability in order for us to build these positive relationships. And we should have high levels of trust. So what are some of the consequences of flourishing at work then? So Professor Rothman has done a number of studies on this, and he found that flourishing kind of has a direct impact on perceptions of general health, lower turnover intention, organizational commitment, and so on. On a team level, it is shown to be more, it stimulates more innovative work behavior. So if I flourish, it provides a bigger opportunity for us to engage in new activities. It helps us to put together better teams and to enhance team cohesion and to enhance further pro-social behaviors. On an organizational level, it has shown that if people flourish, they have lower levels of absenteeism and they perform a lot better. So finally then, how do we go about building, now that we know what flourishing is, what flourishing at work is, what the positive consequences of it are, how can we then go about developing this for our organizations? So firstly, we kind of like know from the work from Sonia Lubomirsky that there are 3 things that's very important here. So 50% of our level of flourishing or happiness for that matter is genetically imprinted, 10% of that is kind of environmentally focused, and 40% of that is kind of on our direct control. I can help you to kind of actualize the things that is under your direct control. And how do we do this? What type of interventions can we use? So our research has shown that you can kind of like structure organizational level interventions, in other words, basically structuring it from an organizational structure perspective to help people to flourish, so building a positive organizational culture, top-down approach, but that's very expensive. We can utilize self-administered intentional activities, which is kind of what Professor Kelders will talk about in a minute, but it's kind of like what can we do from our own perspectives to kind of like help us to build a flourishing workforce. We can do group-based development like training and development centers and leadership empowerment behavior, leadership development initiatives to kind of like help the group to function more effectively together. And we can kind of like utilize things like strengths-based coaching and strengths-based development. However, all of these things, organizational, group-based, and individual coaching and counseling, is extremely expensive. Therefore, we kind of have to think about what can you do as an employee to be able to help you to function more effectively at work and to flourish in your job. So remember this model. It's very important for us to structure our interventions around a validated empirical model so that we can kind of like know what route our energy should flow through in order for us to flourish. So based on this, myself and Professor Marius Stander had a couple of chapters talking about how do we then go about developing flourishing from this perspective. So in order to enhance emotional well-being at work, we kind of have to go about and express gratitude to our employees, but also to ourselves. We have to learn how to forgive mistakes, especially in our context. I think it's quite easy for us to kind of blame other people in order, to kind of like take the attention off ourselves. We have to avoid overthinking and social comparison. I think this is one of the major things that we kind of like do, especially in the South African context. We kind of compare ourselves consistently to other people in order to kind of like construct our impact or our contribution to the society or to the company. But we do contribute things, and we kind of like have to think about what is the things that we uniquely contribute and not necessarily what others do in relation to ourselves. We have to build and create development feedback loops where I'm in a safe environment where I can ask my manager and my colleagues to tell me what am I good at and what am I bad at. Not from a perspective to kind of like fix the things that I'm necessarily bad at, but kind of to help me to grow and develop from that perspective. We have to go into a focus where we kind of like learn from our mistakes, to evaluate the mistakes that we make, the failures that we have in order for us to constructively learn from it. And we have to express our positive experiences in written format. This is one of the techniques that they show us in positive psychology that has the most impact, is expressing yourself in written form, not just verbally, because that has more impact. How do we then build psychological well-being? It's important for us to have stretching goals. In other words, I really need to know where I need to be in 2 or 3 years, and I'm kind of deconstructing that goal into smaller steps to be able to help me to kind of like develop myself in that process. We have to show a willingness to ask for help. When you are suffering, don't suffer in silence. Put yourself out there, ask for help, because only then can you grow and develop. We have to seek out projects or jobs that are in line with our signature strengths, because research shows us that if I'm a creative person and I'm in a creative position, I'm going to flourish. But if I'm a creative person and I'm in an accounting position, well, let's just say people's bank accounts will flourish, but not necessarily you. We have to have multiple mentors available to us, not just one, in order for us to be able to flourish. I have mentors from statisticians right through to my personal growth and development. And I have to have these people readily available so that I can spend time with them and learn from them. So have multiple mentors. The final part then is how do we then go about building positive relationships? And one of the things, for example, when I came to the Netherlands was really interesting for me. We've got this thing in South Africa where we say to everybody, hi, how are you? No, good, thank you, and you. And then you continue with your conversation. But in the Netherlands, the first time I got there, I went to a Spar, or their Albertine, and I asked the lady, like, just as part of kind of my daily ritual, I was like, hi, how are you? And she's like, oh, well, you know, they're kind of like, they broke into my house last night, and it's so loud all of a sudden, and they're like building. And I'm like standing like, why is this woman telling me a whole life story, right? And I was like, oh. But I actually did ask her, so I kind of have to actually listen. And that kind of like reminded me to say, well, we have to have like these meaningful conversations with people where you can actually connect to people in a deeper way, especially at work. Not just going out and asking people, hi, how are they doing, but kind of like constructing our conversation in such a way that we can connect to each other in a deeper level. We have to use active listening, not just like what I do with Marius when we talk, just kind of like waiting for him to finish so I can kind of like just say the things that I'm thinking about, but we kind of have to listen to what they're saying, reflecting the emotion in order to show the person on the other side that you're actually understanding what they're saying. We have to practice kindness and generosity at work, doing things for other people without them necessarily, or without me necessarily wanting something in return. We have to share stories of personal successes, not just the ones of failure. to kind of like share in each other's joy. We have to praise not only achievements, but also failure. And we have to praise effort in order for us to feel like we're actually contributing. Because if we praise failure and we praise effort, we're cultivating a culture of performance, and we make it okay for us to fail. We have to build a network of expertise, knowing if I want to become an excellent researcher, but I'm not really good at writing statistical analysis or any of these things, but I'm excellent at establishing relationships, I must be able to draw these people in with the different skill sets that I need in order to help me to become a better researcher. So the larger your network, the more skills are available to you to draw from. And then finally, you have to act as a mentor for other people, because not only does that provide you with an opportunity to build better relationships with them, but it also helps you with an opportunity to contribute to something larger. Guys, thank you so much for your attention. So then I would like to introduce, well, oh, sorry. Kom eens vooruit. Moet ik sê ons gaan vinnig die audio draai? Is hy online? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, sorry about the change in slides and new presenters and all these types of things. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties. We are unfortunately not going to have Professor Ruud Veenhoven and Professor Fons van der Vyver to present today, because we're really struggling to kind of connect with them. We're going to try to get Professor Saskia Kelders to connect via audio, and then kind of try to utilize her presentation from here. So if you will just bear with us for 2 minutes, we're quickly just going to try the audio. Okay, Saskia, could you kindly just say something for us? So we can try? Okay. Hi Saskia, could you kindly just try and talk to us for a little bit so we can just hear if we can get you connected? No. Hi Saskia, would you be able to just say something so we can see if we can hear you?
Hello? Ah, great.
Who will then kind of present her presentation on utilizing apps as a mechanism to enhance flourishing. Thank you guys so much for being patient with us. Professor, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you all for being patient.
it's always very difficult to talk about technology while using technology because it often goes wrong like this. But what I would like to talk about is about using apps for flourishing. My name is Saskia. I'm from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why smartphones might be easy or might be good to use to increase well-being in individuals. So, for example, smartphones are widely used. I think many of you do have a smartphone and probably also have some apps on it. And they're also used a lot for health reasons. There's many apps out there who try who track the steps you take, or that help you manage your diet or eat healthier. But they're also there for mental health reasons. There's lots of apps out there who can track your mood or help you fight depression or things like that. And the thing about smartphones and about apps is that they're very accessible and they can be used by many people. And because you also use your smartphone throughout the day in your daily life, it also opens up the possibility to intervene in daily life. So thinking about smartphones and also about positive psychology, which is also often about reaching many people and trying to change their behaviors, change their thinking. Um, Technology and apps might be an easy and practical solution for many people to increase their flourishing. And if we change to the next slide, um, you can see a few examples of apps that are out there, more in the positive psychology fields. So first of all, there are many apps, but if you look at the more popular ones, you might find an app as Headspace, which is aimed at mindfulness, at increasing mindfulness. And it really helps you to try and create a routine to maybe practice 10 minutes of mindfulness each day, and by that increase your well-being. A different app is called Super Better. It's always also aimed at improving well-being, more than only mindfulness, but more the general concepts of well-being. And it does so in helping you to overcome challenges. So you can create your own quests and achieve them, and by that increase your well-being on different fields. And it also employs some principles more from gaming. So it tries to make increasing your well-being a little bit like a game to try and motivate you a little bit better. The last app that I would like to just mention briefly is an example of an app that is out there and is trying to increase well-being of people, is Happify. And Happify really provides many exercises and different tracks that are based, most of them are really based on research. And lots of experts from the field of positive psychology have also been consulted or involved with the app to really make the most, the best content, I think, within an app to help people increase their well-being. But if we go to the next slide, that's some of the issues that are out there right now. So because there are so many apps in the different app stores, it can often be really difficult to find the right app for you as an individual. And sometimes it might be easy for individuals, but also for counselors that that want to advise people on using a good app out there to use research, to use studies that have been done. Uh, but in this case, technology is moving a little bit faster, or maybe a lot faster than research is doing. And most apps out there have not been studied for effectiveness. There have been some studies on effectiveness, for example, on mindfulness apps. The Headspace app I mentioned, and also a Dutch mindfulness app. They've been studied, and it has been shown that they can really improve mindfulness of people. And also for other fields like depression and anxiety, there have been a couple of studies on different apps, and it shows that they can really be a good self-management tool. They're often seen as promising, and there are some positive effects. Uh, but that's only for some of the apps in the app stores that we found these results, and that there has been studies. Many or most of the apps in the stores are really not based on research. And the quality is really, really different between apps, and some of them are really quite bad. So if you can't always look at the research to see what is the right app, then what to look for in an app. And in the next slide, um, I have put a few pointers, a few areas that you could look into to see if you've got the right app to help you or others increase their well-being. First of all, it's always important to look at the content. Second, the usability, and last, engagement. And I will go shortly into all these three topics in the next slides. So if we change to the next slide, um, I'll start talking about the content of apps first. And here again, it has been shown in research that it's very important for interventions, also apps for well-being, to be based on theory. So if we're looking at well-being or apps that try to improve flourishing, a very good theory might be the PERMA model of Seligman or the mental health continuum. I think Lewis talked about a bit in the previous presentation as well. So that's a very good basis to start from. But if you want to help people flourish and help them improve their well-being, it's necessary then that you give more than just information. So if you look at an app, if it's going to be the right app, it should have more than just information, also exercises. And luckily, in the field of positive psychology, there are many potentially effective exercises that you could choose from that could be integrated in one of these apps. So content is of course a very important part, but the next important part is usability. An app can be absolutely great in content, but if it's not functional and it's very, very difficult to use, or there's no fit with the context that you're going to use it in or with the users themselves, it will just not work. Because to be effective, it just needs to be functional and be easy to use. So this part is probably some of the easiest things to look at because you will notice right away if an app is usable or not. You don't have to be an expert. You can just tell if it's something that you would like to use on the longer term. And in app stores, this is a criterion that you can see quite well, maybe in star ratings, but also just in the number of downloads. If there's a really bad app there, then chances are they'll just not be downloaded or you need to try it away. So the last topic that I would like to talk about on the next slide is what I think is very, very important within apps for increasing well-being, is that it's not just about an app being usable and having the right content, it also needs to be engaging. For people to really change their behavior, change their way of thinking, if you want to use technology to help you do that, the technology has to be engaging, it has to help you really achieve that. And from a recent study, we interviewed a number of people who were really engaged with a health app. We found that there are three main things that apps need to do to be engaging. And the first one is that it needs to be easy to build a routine. Often these apps are about changing behavior. And an example is the Headspace app that I mentioned. In that they try and help you to maybe just do 10 minutes of mindfulness every day. But they do help you to build a routine. So an app can really help you in doing that and in that way be engaging. The next very important part is that apps can and should stimulate cognition. They should stimulate that you think about what you're doing and why. And one way that an app can do that is by raising the interest and attention. And I think Happify, for example, does that by giving you time and prompts to really reflect on what you were doing. Why did you experience positive emotions? In what context? And raise your interest and attention and really get you thinking about the behavior, not only about the app, but especially about the behavior that you're trying to change. And the last thing that's necessary for an app to be engaging is that it should induce effects. So there's got to be some emotion involved in using an app. And very interestingly, what we found with people who are engaged with an health app, wasn't just about using the app. They did enjoy using the app itself, but they also enjoyed that they could see their own progress within the app. So I think that's a very important thing, and that might sometimes be a bit difficult to do while increasing flourishing, because you won't maybe see progress every day. But gamification elements, so using elements that are common in games, would really be helpful in showing progress in a fun way and helping people enjoy it. So if we go to the next slide, um, we come to the conclusion, and you can see that apps seem to be a very promising way to induce flourishing in individuals. Uh, and there are many apps to choose from. So that's on one hand, that's great because we can give people a lot of options. There might be one out there that's really fitting for every individual. However, research is still lacking at the moment. So we need to make decisions ourselves on which apps to use or to recommend to others. And if you want to do it in a funded evaluation, I think it's very important to look at the content. So is it based on theory? Are there exercises from research in there? Is it usable? Is it easy to use? And most of all, is it engaging? So are you really engaged not only to the app, but also to really changing your behavior in the longer term in daily life? Um, so that's come to the end of the presentation. If you go to the next slide, I'll just say thank you for your patience and your attention. I hope you have a great day and session together.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kelders, for your presentation, and thank you guys, everybody sitting here and also watching from the offices or at home for bearing with us during our technical difficulties. We really hope that you kind of could draw at least something positive from the presentation that you've heard. We had from Professor Franz Cilia talking about the system psychodynamic approach towards understanding flourishing. We had Manoku Ratlagla talking about how do we go about building flourishing communities through Ubuntu, and we had Professor Kelders talking about how do you go about building apps that are functional and effective to build flourishing communities. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and good luck.